Imagine that you are pushing open a worm-eaten wooden door somewhere in France in the year 1257. The smell hits you in the throat before your eyes even have time to adjust to the darkness. Green wood smoke, burnt fat, human bodies pressed together since dawn, and something else, something you don't yet know how to name, something that smells like meat or what's left of it. You sit down. A steaming bowl is set before you, and you are about to eat. What you don't know yet is that this meal could kill you. Not in the figurative sense, not as a metaphor for the harshness of the times, but in the literal, clinical sense, documented by the medical records of the era, which describe men and women burning from the inside, losing their fingers, falling into convulsions that their contemporaries mistook for demonic possession. All of this because of a meal, perhaps a meal like the one you're looking at in this tavern. Today we are going to enter this world, not to laugh at it, not to feel superior, but to understand something essential. What a people eat tells you everything about what that people endures. And what people ate in a medieval tavern in the middle of the 13th century tells you everything about a world suspended between hunger and survival, between flavor and poison, between feast and death. Hold on tight, because the menu is packed. The France of 1257 is a world we can barely recognize. Louis IX, the one whom posterity will call St. Louis, has reigned for 23 years over a kingdom that counts perhaps 13 or 14 million souls. Paris is a city in full ferment, with its 50,000 inhabitants, perhaps, its constant construction sites, its Sorbonne that is only about 30 years old, its bridges crowded with merchants, its muddy alleys where the smell of tanneries mingles with that of bakeries. It is a time of construction, ambition, intense faith, and everyday violence. A time when the Sainte-Chapelle has just been consecrated, when the Crusades continue to bleed the continent, when the great cathedral of Chartres has been finished for only a few decades. And it is a time when the Tavern is, for millions of people, the only place where one can eat something hot. Let us understand this before we sit down to eat. In the 13th century, a considerable proportion of the urban population lived in dwellings without kitchens, without fireplaces, without any space to make a fire. Historians who have studied the medieval city document this clearly. For the lower classes, eating at home is often not possible. It is not a matter of choice, it is a matter of housing structure. So, people eat outside, they eat in the street, at the passing caterers, or in the local tavern. The tavern is not an optional place of pleasure. For many, it is an absolute necessity. And in this tavern, who are you? That depends entirely on your social rank. Because one of the most striking things about medieval food is that it is not just a matter of food. It is a social statement, a language, a way of telling the whole world, with every bite, which category of humanity you belong to. Medical texts and culinary treatises of the time stated explicitly, every food has its place in a cosmic hierarchy, and you must eat according to your rank or risk upsetting your humors and falling ill. This is not a metaphor. The doctors of the time sincerely believed that vegetables growing in the ground were meant for those who lived close to the earth, the peasants, artisans, and common folk, while the noble meat, which comes from higher up, was intended for those who naturally rose above the common soil, knights, lords, and high-ranking clergy. So you enter the tavern with a food identity that is already predetermined. Let's take a seat. The room has a low ceiling. The walls are made of rough stone or wattle and daub depending on the place, covered in soot that has built up over years. The floor is made of packed earth, covered with rushes and straw that the innkeeper changes from time to time, but never all the way down, because removing the lower layers is a never-ending task. Beneath this plant litter, historians and archaeologists have found animal bones, excrement, and food remains that have long since decomposed. Parasites thrive there, fleas, lice, mice. No one pays any attention. It's the ordinary background noise of medieval life. At the back of the room, there is a fire, or rather, there is the fire, the only source of heat, the only way to cook, the center around which all the life of the establishment revolves. The smoke rises, but not always toward the hole made in the roof for that purpose. It spreads out, it seeps into clothing, into hair, into lungs. People who work in these medieval kitchens spend their lives in a constant cloud of acrid smoke. It's not romantic, it's irritating, it's harmful, it's the daily reality. But above all, it's over this fire that your meal is being prepared. This is what awaits you. The first element of your meal, the fundamental, essential, universal element, is bread. In the 13th century, each adult consumes on average about 1 kilogram of bread per day. 1 kilogram is not a fanciful estimate. Medieval records confirm it. Bread is calories, bread is energy, bread is the very foundation of medieval nutrition. Everything else revolves around it. But what kind of bread are we talking about? That once again depends on who you are. If you are rich, if you have money and status, your bread is white, made from well-sifted, very white wheat flour, a shining symbol of social status. That bread is good. That bread looks like something you would recognize. If you are like the vast majority of people crowded into this tavern, your bread is black or gray, made from rye, barley or oats, sometimes mixed with clay or milling dust, sometimes containing substances the miller has slipped in to increase the volume and thus his profits. The bread of the people in the 13th century is often stale, often hard, sometimes moldy, and sometimes it is deadly. Here is what the people of 1257 do not yet understand, what science will not clearly understand for several centuries. Rye can be infected by a tiny fungus called Claviceps purpurea. This fungus produces small blackish growths on the ears of grain, called ergot, which contain extremely toxic alkaloids. When this contaminated rye is ground into flour, when this flour is used to make bread, the poison ends up in every bite and no one notices it. Rye flour is naturally dark, so the ergot is perfectly hidden in it. What people do see is what happens next. The victims first experience burning sensations in their limbs. An unbearable heat rises from their extremities, as if something were burning from the inside. That's where the name given to this disease by contemporaries comes from, St. Anthony's fire, or the disease of the burning ones. Some lose their minds, some have terrifying hallucinations. Some begin to see and hear things that others do not, behaving in ways that their neighbors can only interpret as demonic possession. And in the most severe cases, dry gangrene sets in, the fingers turn black, and the limbs begin to die slowly from the extremities toward the center. They fall off. Entire epidemics of this disease devastate villages and regions throughout the Middle Ages. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people at the same time, struck by the same agony, all from the same cursed bread. And no one in the tavern of 1257 knows that it is the bread that kills. No one has made the connection yet. People pray, go on pilgrimages, and carry the sick to the relics of saints. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony even founded specialized hospices to treat these strange and terrifying cases. But the cause remains invisible, misunderstood, hidden within the flour itself. You take a piece of this bread and place it in front of you. Let's move on. In your bowl, there's a thick, dark brown steaming liquid. It's either pottage or perhaps soup. Both exist, and the distinction is not just a matter of semantics. Soup is more liquid, pottage is thicker, sometimes almost like a porridge. What the innkeeper serves you depends on the season, on what he found at the market that morning, on what is left over from the day before, and in some cases on what has been in the pot for 3 days. Because here is a reality that is not often mentioned. In many medieval taverns, the stew pot never completely stops simmering. The pot stays on the fire. New ingredients are added to it as time goes on, portions are taken out to be served, but the cooking base, the broth, can be several days old. This is not a practice that is precisely documented for every establishment, but medieval sources and historical analyses of these culinary practices clearly suggest that keeping the broth going was common. What you drink from your bowl tonight may contain the essence of yesterday and the day before. What's in this soup? It varies. Basically vegetables, turnips, leeks, onions, fava beans, peas. These vegetables are the food of the poor, those that grow in the ground, as stipulated by the medieval food hierarchy. Maybe a bit of herbs, parsley, savory, chives. Herbs are everywhere in medieval cooking, and not just for flavor. They have been used for centuries to mask other, less pleasant aromas, to give the impression of freshness to something that is no longer quite fresh. And maybe, if luck is on your side and your purse allows, a few pieces of meat. Meat. Now that's a subject worth lingering on. In the 13th century, meat was a social marker of such importance that it's hard for us to imagine today. In a world where refrigerators do not exist, where artificial cold is impossible, and where food preservation relies entirely on salt, smoke, drying, vinegar, and honey, fresh meat is a luxury that spoils within a few hours in warm weather and within a few days, even in winter. Handling it, preserving it, selling it without poisoning your customers, this is an art that not all butchers and tavern keepers master with the same rigor. The most common meat in taverns is pork and its derivatives. The medieval pig is an extraordinarily useful animal, generally slaughtered in November or December, when temperatures are low enough to allow for decent preservation. The pieces are salted, smoked, turned into bacon, sausages, pâtés, and andouille sausages. These are the products that can still be found in taverns months after the slaughter. But salting is not a perfect method. It slows down putrefaction, but it does not stop it. And no one yet knows about the concept of bacteria. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that the line between safe meat and dangerous meat is invisible to the naked eye. A piece of bacon that still smells of salt and smoke can very well contain pathogens that the people of 1257 are unable to detect. Cooking helps, of course. The heat from the fire kills a large number of harmful organisms. Medieval medical texts, moreover, systematically recommend cooking meat for a long time, first in boiling water, then over embers, as a precaution. But in a crowded and hurried tavern, precaution is not always the priority. There is also a documented practice that deserves to be mentioned carefully: the use of spices to mask the condition of the meat. Here is a myth that historians of medieval food have been fighting for decades, both to nuance and not to completely dismiss. The simplistic thesis that spices in the Middle Ages were used to mask the taste of spoiled meat is false in its caricatured form. Spices are above all markers of social status, expensive, precious, and brought from the East via trade routes crossing the Mediterranean. A modest innkeeper does not waste pepper on rotten meat. He throws it away or eats it himself, but there is a gray area. Meat that is starting to go bad but isn't truly spoiled yet. Meat whose smell is slightly suspicious but which can be concealed in a spiced soup with cumin and coriander. Here, in this gray area, spices do indeed play a role. Not systematically, not deliberately as we might imagine, but truly in borderline cases. And in a popular tavern in 1157, borderline cases were probably frequent. You are also given a piece of harder, drier bread, which serves as a trencher. The trencher is a dense slice of bread on which pieces of meat are placed, absorbing the cooking juices. After the meal, it is given to the dogs or to the poor waiting outside. Sometimes you eat it yourself. It is both a plate and a food, and it is soaked with everything that has dripped onto it during the meal. At this point, let's go back to something important that is often forgotten when talking about the medieval tavern. How did people eat? Not what they ate, but how. The fork at the table is an invention that would come later, during the Renaissance, and would take centuries more to become widespread. In 1257, people ate with their fingers, using a personal knife that each guest carried with them. Dishes were shared, hands were dipped into the same bowls, and people drank from the same pitcher. The idea of germs and contagion through contact does not exist. People wash their hands before and after the meal. This is part of good manners, as confirmed by the texts. But this washing is done in water that may have already been used by 10 other people, drawn from a common source whose purity is not guaranteed by any modern infrastructure. Which brings us to the most crucial topic of the entire meal: the drink. In a medieval tavern, people do not drink water. Or rather, they do not drink pure water, deliberately, consciously, because everyone knows, not for scientific reasons, but due to empirical observations accumulated over generations, that water can kill you. Not the water from rivers that runs fast and clean, not the spring water that people are familiar with, but the water from urban wells, the water from streams that run through the city collecting waste from tanneries, butcher shops, overflowing latrines, and pigs that roam freely in the streets feeding on organic garbage. That water, people in the 13th century know they must not drink. Not because they know about bacteria, but because they've seen what happens to those who drink it. Dysentery, fevers, abdominal pain that lasts for weeks, death. So, people drink wine. Wine is the staple drink of Christian medieval Europe, and especially of France. Not the wine we drink today, with its carefully cultivated taste, complexities, and controlled designations. Tavern wine in the 13th century is a much rougher product. It is acidic. It is often mixed with water, but with selected water, not just any kind. It can hardly be kept for more than a year, and after that, it turns to vinegar. The Parisian taverns, according to the texts that have come down to us, sell a French wine produced from the vineyards on the hillsides of the Seine, an ordinary wine intended for an ordinary clientele. The quality of this wine varies. It varies greatly. And here again, there are many opportunities for fraud and adulteration. Medieval ordinances document these problems. Tavern keepers who dilute the wine with questionable water, who add substances to correct the taste when it starts to go bad, who serve wine of a lower quality than what they advertised. The profession of wine crier, who roamed the streets to announce prices and ensure a certain transparency in the market, existed precisely because mistrust was widespread. Tavern wine was not necessarily bad, but it was not always what it claimed to be. There was also cervoise, the ancestor of our beer, brewed from barley or other fermented grains, without hops in the oldest versions, and flavored with various herbs to give it its taste. In the northern regions where vines grow poorly, cervoise is the dominant drink. It was less alcoholic than wine, and like any fermented beverage, it was safer than raw water. Children drank it. Adults consumed it daily, often starting in the morning. This was not a habit of debauchery, but a sanitary necessity. And then there is hippocras. Hippocras is a prestigious drink, a spiced wine mixed with honey and oriental spices. Cinnamon, ginger, cardamom, clove. It is sometimes attributed to Hippocrates, which gives it a medical aura in addition to its gustatory appeal. Hippocras is expensive. It is not served to just anyone in any tavern. It is a drink for festivities, for celebration, for social display. If someone orders it next to you tonight, it means something. It clearly says, this man has money. This man does not belong in this common room. But let's get back to your pitcher of ordinary wine. You drink. It is acidic, slightly cloudy. You are told that it is a good wine from this year. What you don't know, what no one around you knows, is that if the wine ages poorly and turns, the corrective methods used by the master winemakers of the 14th century, as described in the Viandier de Taille Levante, would include adding wine lees and other substances. In 1257, written codification has not yet reached that point. You make do with what you have, you adapt. And sometimes you make a mistake. The room around you starts to fill up more as the evening goes on. Conversations grow louder, someone is playing a string instrument in a corner, dice roll across a table. The ecclesiastical authorities of the time viewed this social function of the tavern very unfavorably. The theologians of the 13th century spoke of the tavern as a fountain of sin, a church of the devil, and you can understand why they were worried. In this space that escapes their control, people eat, drink, gamble, incur debts, exchange subversive news, and meet outside of any moral supervision. But for the people who are here tonight, the tavern is not a place of perdition. It is a place of survival. It's where you eat. It's where you warm yourself. It's where you learn what's happening in the city, in the kingdom, in the world. Your meal continues. Something more substantial is placed in front of you. Perhaps a pork stew with root vegetables, perhaps pieces of poultry in a broth thickened with bread. Because medieval sauces are thickened with bread, never with flour as would be done later. And this technical difference produces textures and flavors that we can barely recognize today. Perhaps fish if it is a fasting day, and there are about 150 of those each year in the medieval Christian calendar. Fridays, Saturdays, the 40 days of Lent, the periods before, the vigils of major feasts. For about half the year, the church forbids meat and requires the faithful to turn to fish. This fish, in taverns far from the sea, is dried cod, smoked herring, salted eels. These are products that have traveled hundreds of kilometers in barrels of salt before reaching your bowl. The preservation is excellent in the best cases, less so in the worst. And once again, no one has any tools to determine where the line is between the two. Let's also think about spices, which deserve a moment of special attention. Medieval spices are extraordinary. Not in the romantic sense of the word, but in the etymological sense, out of the ordinary. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron, nutmeg, grains of paradise. These substances travel from India, from Southeast Asia, from Africa, along trade routes that cross the Near East and the Mediterranean. At each stage, they change hands. At each stage, their price increases. When they arrive in a French tavern in 1257, they have traveled for months, sometimes years. Their cost is astronomical compared to the standard of living of an artisan or a peasant. And yet they are there, in the tavern keeper's dishes, in the stews he carefully prepares to attract customers willing to pay a little more. Because spices mean something. They mean that the cook has skill, that the establishment is not miserable, that the food you are served is not the last gruel of the destitute. Spices are a language, and in this language even the common people want to have their say. The encyclopedist Bartholomeus Anglicus, writing in the 13th century, claims that cinnamon comes from the nest of the phoenix. We may smile, but this legend says something important. Spices are so distant, so mysterious in their origin, that the medieval imagination surrounds them with a world of wonders. They come from an inaccessible elsewhere, and that is precisely what makes them so valuable. Let's return to your plate, because there's still something else to note. There is no fork. There might be a spoon if you are in a relatively well-kept establishment. You have your knife and you have your fingers. You eat the way everyone ate in 1257, directly, physically, in full contact with your food, and you eat on a trencher of bread that you might be sharing with your table neighbor. That neighbor whom you don't know, that neighbor who might be coughing a little, that neighbor whose hands may have touched the same surfaces as yours before the meal. The physical closeness in the medieval tavern is absolute, and in a world without any concept of bacterial contagion, without any understanding of how diseases are transmitted, it is completely innocent in the sense that no one pays attention because no one knows what to pay attention to. It's not just the food itself that can affect you. There's the entire space in which you eat it. The rushes on the floor that have been harboring parasites for months. The bowls and pitchers rinsed with water. What water? Between two services. The work surfaces that the cook has no way of disinfecting in our modern sense of the word. The tavern keeper's hands who also tended to the pigs this morning. The air itself, which medieval theorists call miasmas and suspect of carrying diseases without being able to identify their true nature. And despite all that, despite everything, people live. They eat in these taverns, they drink that harsh wine, they tear apart that dark and sometimes dangerous bread, and they survive. Most of them. A good part of the next generation is there to bear witness to it. The human body is an extraordinarily adaptable machine, and medieval populations developed over generations resistances, partial immunities, and physiological tolerances to pathogens that we would have trouble enduring today because our bodies have not been exposed to them in the same way for centuries. But some do not survive. This is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Medieval life expectancy is often presented in figures 25, 30, 35 years, which mostly reflect catastrophic infant mortality. Those who make it through the first years have a good chance of living to 50 or 60 years old. But this survival is never guaranteed. It is negotiated with every meal, every sip of water, every winter when food supplies run out before spring arrives. And famine, that constant companion of medieval life, changes everything when it comes to the tavern's food supply. Years of poor harvests, harsh winters, wars that destroy crops, epidemics that decimate farmers before the harvest. When all of this accumulates, the contents of the tavern bowl are not just modest, they become critical. You eat what you have, you eat what is available, and what is available can be very, very dangerous. Imagine that you are in this tavern in 1157 during a difficult year. Maybe the rye harvest was poor, maybe the granaries are running low. The baker used rye of questionable quality, taken from a stock that had been sitting around for too long, contaminated from the start by that invisible fungus, Claviceps purpurea, which no one yet knows by that name. Your bread tonight may contain a few grams of ergot, maybe less, maybe more. The next morning, you wake up with a strange sensation in your hands, a warmth, a burning feeling. You tell yourself it's just fatigue or the wine from last night. 3 days later, you realize it wasn't the wine. This story is not exceptional. It appears in the archives that remain to us as something terribly ordinary. Entire villages struck by St. Anthony's fire, processions of the sick carried on stretchers to the hospices of the Antonine monks, men and women praying for God to take away this inner burning, never knowing that the burning came from the bread. A blessed bread, perhaps on Sunday, a bread carefully prepared, a bread that kills. But this dark reality coexists with something profoundly human. The medieval tavern, despite everything we've just described, is also an extraordinary place of life. It is there that commercial contracts are concluded, that news spreads before any other means of information, that men debate the politics of the kingdom, the latest sermon heard at the cathedral, and rumors of war coming from the east. It is there that the lower classes find a warmth that is lacking in their own homes. It is there that people celebrate, drink to the health of friends, and where traveling musicians play in exchange for a meal. The tavern is dangerous, but the tavern is alive in a way that we may have lost in our sanitized restaurants and refrigerated supermarkets. This is one of the questions that this world poses to us, we who live in the most sophisticated era of food modernity in human history. We are surrounded by protections that people in 1257 could not have imagined. The cold chain, health inspections, bacteriological standards, allergen labeling, traceability systems that allow a batch of products to be recalled within 48 hours. And yet food crises still exist. Health scandals still exist. Dangerous products still end up on our plates, sometimes making it through all the controls, sometimes due to systemic failures that our medieval ancestors would have recognized perfectly well. Commercial pressure, the temptation to commit fraud, the invisibility of danger. This is not to downplay the suffering of the people in 1257, but to acknowledge something deeper. The struggle for healthy food, for food that does not kill, for standards that protect the most vulnerable, is a struggle as old as civilization itself. Medieval butchers were subject to stricter health regulations than one might imagine. Charters, municipal ordinances, inspectors appointed by lords or towns. Parisian tavern keepers were monitored by wine measurers appointed by the king. There were laws, there were inspections. They were imperfect, they were circumvented, they were insufficient, but they existed because the desire to eat without risking one's life is an aspiration as old as humanity itself. The main difference between them and us is not the intention, but the knowledge. They didn't know, and we know, or at least we know much more. The question that arises then is what we do with what we know. There is something left in your bowl. A bit of soup at the bottom, a few crumbs of bread. The pitcher is almost empty. The room was now noisy, warm, smoky. Someone has won at dice, someone else has lost. The innkeeper's wife shouts from the kitchen for her husband to bring back the empty pitchers. A dog has slipped under the tables and is searching for scraps that fall. You look at what is left in your bowl and you think of something. For centuries, this man, the man who is sitting where you are now, in 1257, ate this meal without knowing all its dangers. He did not live in fear, he did not refuse to eat. He took what was in front of him. He broke bread with his neighbors. He drank from the same pitcher and most often lived to tell someone else about this evening. Perhaps that is the strangest lesson of this tavern. Not the invisible poisons in the rye, not the meat preserved to the edge of edibility, not the dubious water hidden in the wine, but the human capacity to sit before uncertainty, to break bread with others, to eat together despite the risks, to build conviviality in conditions that we would today call outrageous. We are the heirs of these men and women, of their endurance, their resilience, their ability to find human warmth in the most unlikely places. This is not a romanticization of the past. It is an acknowledgement of what humanity is capable of enduring and of what it would never want to experience again. The worm-eaten wooden door opens behind you. A draft sweeps through the room. The smell of the medieval night, damp earth, smoke from the city's chimneys, and something that vaguely resembles meat or warm bread somewhere in the darkness fills the air. You have returned. You are safe, but you may not so quickly forget what you have just come to understand about what it means to eat and about everything we have spent centuries building so that this simple act is no longer a matter of survival.